How are you? Many of the strangest fairy stories can also be classified as horror stories. We know from myths and fairy tales that there are many different powers in this world. One child is given a lightsaber, another a wizard's education. The trick is not to amass all the different kinds of power, but to use well the kind you've been granted. This is the story of one such power. The Nest of Nightingales, written by Theophile Gautier, translated by George Burnham Ives, and told to you by Edward E. French. About the chateau there was a beautiful park. In the park there were birds of all kinds, nightingales, blackbirds, and linnets. All the birds of the earth had made a rendezvous of the park. In the spring there was such an uproar that one could not hear oneself talk. Every leaf concealed a nest. Every tree was an orchestra. All the little feathered musicians vied with one another in melodious contest. Some chirped, others cooed, some performed trills and pearly cadences, others executed bravura passages and elaborate flourishes. Genuine musicians could not have done so well. But in the chateau there were two fair cousins who sang better than all the birds in the park. Fleurette was the name of one, and Isabeau that of the other. Both were lovely, alluring, and in good case. And on Sundays, when they wore their fine clothes, if their white shoulders had not proved they were real maidens, one might have taken them for angels. They lacked only wings. When they sang, old Sire de Malivrier, their uncle, sometimes held their hands, for fear that they might take it into their heads to fly away. I leave you to imagine the gallant lance thrusts that were exchanged at tournaments and carousels in honor of Fleurette and Isabeau. Their reputation for beauty and talent had made the circuit of Europe, and yet they were none the prouder for it. They lived in retirement, seeing almost nobody save the little page Valentine, a pretty, fair-haired child, and Sire de Malarbrier, a hoary-headed old man, all tanned by the sun and worn out by having borne his war harness 60 years. They passed their time in tossing seeds to the little birds, in saying their prayers, and above all, in studying the works of the masters and in rehearsing together some motet, madrigal, villanelle, or other music of the sort. They also had flowers, which they themselves watered and tended. Their life passed in these pleasant and poetical maidenly occupations. They remained in the chateau, far from the eyes of the world, and yet the world busied itself about them. Neither the nightingale nor the rose can conceal itself. Their melody and their perfume always betray them. Now our two cousins were at once nightingales and roses. There came dukes and princes to solicit their hands in marriage. The Emperor of Trebizond and the Sultan of Egypt sent ambassadors to propose an alliance to Sire de Malarbrier. The two cousins were not weary of being maidens and would not listen to any mention of the subject. Perhaps a secret instinct had informed them that their mission here on earth was to remain maidens and to sing, and that they would lower themselves by doing anything else. They had come to that manor when they were very small. The window of their bedroom looked upon the park, and they had been lulled asleep by the singing of the birds. When they could scarcely walk, old Blondio, the old lord's minstrel, had placed their tiny hands on the ivory keys of the virginal. They had possessed no other toy, and had learned to sing before they had learned to speak. They sang as others breathed. It was natural to them. This sort of education had a peculiar influence on their characters. Their melodious childhood had separated them from the ordinary boisterous and chattering one. They had never uttered a shriek or a discordant wail. They went in rhythm and wailed in tune. The musical sense developed in them at the expense of the other senses made them quite insusceptible to anything that was not music. They lived in a melodious place, and had almost no perception of the real world otherwise than by musical notes. They understood wonderfully the rustling of the foliage, the murmur of the streams, the striking of the clock, the sigh of the wind in the fireplace, the hum of the spinning wheel, the dropping of the rain on the shivering grass, all varieties of harmony without or within. But they did not feel, I am bound to say, great enthusiasm at the sight of a sunset, and they were as little capable of approaching a painting as if their lovely blue and black eyes had been covered with a thick film. They had the musical sickness. They dreamed of it. It deprived them of their appetite. They loved nothing else in the whole world. But yes, they did love something else. Valentine and their flowers. Valentine because he resembled the roses because they resembled Valentine. But that love was altogether in the background. To be sure, Valentine was but 13 years of age. Their greatest pleasure was to sing at their window in the evening the music which they had composed during the day. The most celebrated masters came from long distances to hear them and to contend with them. The visitors had no sooner listened to one measure than they broke their instruments and tore up their scores, confessing themselves vanquished. In very truth, the music was so pleasant to the ear and so melodious that the cherubim from heaven came to the window with the other musicians and learned it by heart to sing to the good Lord. One evening in May, the two cousins were singing a motet for two voices. Never was a lovelier air more beautifully composed and executed. A nightingale in the park, perched upon a rose bush, listened attentively to them. When they had finished, he flew to the window and said to them, in nightingale language, "I would like to compete in song with you." The two cousins replied that they would do it willingly, and that he might begin. The nightingale began. He was a master among nightingales. His little throat swelled, his wings fluttered, his whole body trembled. He poured forth roulades, flourishes, arpeggios, and chromatic scales. He ascended and descended. He sang notes and trills with discouraging purity. One would have said that his voice, like his body, had wings. He paused, well assured that he had won victory. The two cousins performed in their turn. They surpassed themselves. The song of the nightingale, compared with theirs, seemed like the chirping of a sparrow. The vanquished virtuoso made a last attempt. He sang a love romanza. Then he executed a brilliant flourish, which he crowned with a shower of high, vibrating, and shrill notes beyond the range of any human voice. The two cousins, undeterred by that wonderful performance, turned the leaves of their book of music and answered the nightingale in such a wise that Saint Cecilia, who listened in heaven, turned pale with jealousy and let her viol fall to earth. The nightingale tried again to sing, but the contest had utterly exhausted him. His breath failed him. His feathers drooped, his eyes closed. Despite his efforts, he was at the point of death. "You sang better than I," he said of the two cousins, "and my pride, by making me try to surpass you, has cost me my life. I ask one favor at your hands. I have a nest. In that nest there are 3 little ones. It is on the 3rd eglantine, in the broad avenue beside the pond. Send someone to fetch them to you. Bring them up and teach them to sing as you do, for I am dying." Having spoken, the nightingale died. The two cousins wept bitterly for him, for he had sung well. They called Valentine, the fair-haired little page, and told him where the nest was. Valentine, who was a shrewd little rascal, readily found the place. He put the nest in his breast and carried it to the chateau without harm. Florette and Isabeau, leaning on the balcony rail, were awaiting him impatiently. Valentine soon arrived, holding the nest in his hands. The 3 little ones had their heads over the edge, with their beaks wide open. The girls were moved to pity by the little orphans and fed them each in turn. When they had grown a little, they began their musical education, as they had promised the vanquished nightingale. It was wonderful to see how tame they became, how well they sang. They went fluttering about the room, and perched now upon Isabeau's head, now upon Florette's shoulder. They lighted in front of the music book, and in very truth one have said that they were able to read the notes. With such an intelligent air did they scan the white ones and the black ones. They learned all Florette's and Isabeau's melodies, and began to improvise some very pretty ones themselves. The two cousins lived more and more in solitude, and at night strains of supernal melody were heard to issue from their chamber. The nightingales, perfectly taught, took their parts in the concert, and they sang almost as well as their mistresses, who themselves had made great progress. Their voices assumed each day extraordinary brilliancy, and vibrated in metallic and crystalline tones far above the register of the natural voice. The young women grew perceptibly thin. Their lovely coloring faded. They became as pale as agates and almost as transparent. Sire de Balevrier tried to prevent their singing, but he could not prevail upon them. As soon as they had sung a measure or two, a little red spot appeared upon their cheekbones, and grew larger and larger until they had finished. Then the spot disappeared, but a cold sweat issued from their skin, and their lips trembled as if they had a fever. But their singing was more beautiful than ever. There was in it a something not of this world, and to one who heard those sonorous and powerful voices issuing from those two fragile maidens, it was not difficult to foresee what would happen, that the music would shatter the instrument. They realized it themselves, and returned to their virginal, which they had abandoned for vocal music. But one night, the window was open, the birds were twittering in the park, the night wind sighed harmoniously. There was so much music in the air that they could not resist the temptation to sing a duet that they had composed the night before. It was the swan song, a wondrous melody all drenched with tears, ascending to the most inaccessible heights of the scale and redescending the ladder of notes to the lowest round, something dazzling and incredible, a deluge of trills, a fiery rain of chromatic flourishes, a display of musical fireworks, impossible to describe. But meanwhile, the little red spot grew rapidly larger and almost covered their cheeks. The three nightingales watched them and listened to them with painful anxiety. They flapped their wings, and went and came, and could not remain in one place. At last the maidens reached the last bar of the duet. Their voices assumed a sonority so extraordinary that it was easy to understand that they who sang were no longer living creatures. The nightingales had taken flight. The two cousins were dead. Their souls had departed with the last note. The nightingales had ascended straight to heaven to carry that last song to the good Lord, who kept them all in his paradise to perform the music of the two cousins for him. Later, with these three nightingales, the good Lord made the souls of Palestrina, of Cimarosa, and of Gluck. What do you think? The names Cimarosa, Gluck, and Palestrina refer to Domenico Cimarosa, 1749-1801, who wrote more than 80 operas, most of them comedies. He also wrote instrumental works and church music. Christoph Willibald Ritter von Gluck, 1714 to 1787, was so strongly influenced by French opera that he moved from Germany to Paris in 1773, where he wrote 8 operas for the Parisian stage. He was extremely popular and widely credited with bringing about a revolution in French opera. Giovanni Pierluigi de Palestrina, 1525 to 1594, was a Renaissance composer of sacred music who had a long-lasting influence on the development of church and secular music in Europe. We're listening to his music right now. Sweet. I guess Giovanni will take us out of here. As ever, thank you for listening. I'll be back again next week with another Fiction Fantastique. The Nest of Nightingales by Theophile Gautier is copyright 2020 by Edward E. French, all rights reserved. The copyright exists on all recordings made by Edward E. French. Inquire at email edwardfrench06@hotmail.com.